I really care about people. I love people. I wanted to be a cancer research specialist to cure cancer. And it seems to me that one of the worst things that happened from the fallout from the Kennedy assassination is that when Richard Nixon came into power, one of his very first acts, thank you, one of his very first acts was to call a war on cancer. Now, you have lived in this country long enough to know if the government proclaims a war on something, that means it's not going to happen. So all this material that had been worked on, and including nascent activities that could have cured cancer, all were collected and sent to Fort Detrick, including some biological weapons having to do with weaponizing cancer. Sent to Fort Detrick, there you saw that they had 1,000 or more technicians and scientists working there, but the cancer stuff disappears. And in place of that, we have a huge industry that arose with magnificent buildings, palm trees, fountains, statues, and we call them cancer treatment centers. Cancer treatment is the course used, not cancer cure. But it makes a lot of money. And a lot of people don't like me talking about this because we could have cured cancer back in the 70s. We know that for a lot of reasons. For example, Pope John the 23rd had stomach cancer, died of it. There was an envoy that was sent to the Vatican, but it wasn't in time, with a cancer serum that they thought would save his life. None of you have ever heard of cancer serum. That was shelved. I'm going to give you an example. Bacteriophage is a virus. And it's a virus that looks like a little mosquito walks along, you know, and has a little dipper or sipper that can go and punch into a bacterium. Now, what happens when bacteria are attacked by bacteriophage? Phage means eat. I mean, these little guys can just surround and swarm over a piece of bacteria, a living cell, and eat it alive. And then, if there aren't any more, they go to sleep. So, you know, they don't eat other cells alive. There's the ones that they're engineered for. Bacteriophage could have been engineered to go and attack cancer. But if you look on the internet, you'll find out that they've used bacteriophage, which is cheap, very cheap. And of course, if you cure cancer, you don't have this industry anymore. Bacteriophage is being used to deliver nanopackets of chemotherapy to cancer cells today. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing, because that can be patented and that can make a lot of money. Average cancer sufferer, they're handing over about $300,000 to insurance companies and from the cancer patients themselves. Whereas overseas, cancer treatment is free in almost every European country. I'm asking you why I had to pay yesterday. I had to choose between paying $18 or $54 for 30 little pills that I have to have because they were stolen from my luggage, thyroid pills. I had to pay either 18 for the generic form, which is not very good, or 54. I chose to pay 18 because I'm coming here on donations, and I don't want to use money unwisely. Overseas, these 30 pills would have cost 10 cents a piece, $3. Now, ask you why. Our government here does not place any kind of cap on the prices of medicines that you have to survive. Why do we have this ethical problem? Well, maybe let's look all the way back to, I call it the Cutter vaccine incident. And that's before the early 1960s. It's in the 1950s when Alton Oxner brought in his granddaughter, his grandson. Grandson's just a little toddler, granddaughter just a little bit older, calls in everybody and says, I want to show you how safe the polio vaccine is. Come on in, press, come on in, doctors. And he injected his own grandchildren to prove that this was safe. 1 week later, his grandson was dead, and his little girl, his little granddaughter, had polio. Dr. Oxner learned a big lesson that day. And when we trust vaccines, what kind of lesson was learned from that? A few years later, in 1963, They were showing you everybody, taking these sugar cubes full of the polio vaccine. People were lining up, and all the little kids were lining up. What was in the polio vaccine at that time? The SV40 monkey virus was in it. That same virus was causing monkeys to develop polioma, many different kinds of cancer, in a matter of days and weeks when they were injected or were given the same material. They had 95 million contaminated doses of polio that could cause polioma, cancer, in all these kinds of simians. And of course, by the way, we're related to the monkeys. Approximately 98% of our chromosomes are the same. Today we have leukemia in cats and dogs. They live with us. They're often eating dog food, cat food that comes from condemned carcasses that have cancer in them that are not unfit for human consumption. And they're getting leukemia and things they never got before. But what about you? 95 million in this country, and many of these doses were sent overseas. They knew it was contaminated. Sarah Stewart, who was a friend of Dr. Mary Sherman, the person who mentored me, who worked with me, this woman, when she reported it, they destroyed her career. And I've got some books here, Dr. Mary's Monkey, that can tell you more about it. Edward Haslam learned about me while working on trying to find out what had happened to Dr. Mary Sherman, who also knew about this and was brutally murdered on the 21st of July, 1964, the same day the Warren Commission came to get testimonies. How was she related? How was all of this related to the J.F.K. assassination? Well, first of all, Lee Oswald is the key. One of the reasons they keep all of this back, that's going to open a big can of worms when you find out that he was sent to New Orleans to oversee and protect the project we were working on so it wouldn't get in the wrong hands. He would pose as pro-Castro and like a communist out there handing out leaflets. I don't know how many spies from Castro that he actually gathered up through his activities so they wouldn't find us. Castro was sending his spies to New Orleans. New Orleans had been cut off. 25% of their trade had been coming from Cuba. Half of their trade was in danger because Castro's communist ideas were taking over parts of South and Central America. You had big banana companies, these banana republics, they put dictators in. The U.S. was running them. The people were miserable. They were ready for change. They could have turned communist. There was a great deal of anxiety that Castro had to be killed. One of those people who believed that was Dr. Alton Ochsner, and he had INCA, I-N-C-A. He was a co-founder of this organization, which is you have to think about INCA was an association that made all kinds of tapes. They called them truth tapes, sent them out all over Central South America, Mexico, to probably over 150 radio stations at the height. And among those was a recording that was made by Lee Harvey Oswald, but they never sent that one out. They held on to that for a few more months, and then when Lee Oswald was accused of killing Kennedy, they put it out there, and that tape said Lee was saying that he was a Marxist and that people should look at Cuba with new eyes and so on. That was propaganda Lee was putting out there. Why? By the way, Alton Ochsner's picture is on the back of this album they sent out, that INCA sent out. It's called Portrait in Red, and it's supposed to show how Lee Oswald was a communist. Even in the newspapers they put he was a communist and openly proud of it. Now I want to tell you right now, even when he was a fake defector in the Soviet Union, he didn't join the Communist Party, even when he was in the USSR. And he made a good excuse for it to the Soviets. He said, if I go back to America and I join the Communist Party, I won't be good for you as a spy. So that's what he told them. He was a smart and wholesome person, didn't smoke, didn't drink, didn't even swear, except maybe say damn. And he also liked to pretend that he was doing what Herbert Philbrick had done. That was his hero. Herbert Philbrick of I Led Three Lives. In the early, mid-50s, Herbert Philbrick was exposed as a person who was not a communist. After all, he wasn't a communist. Wait a minute. That man wasn't a communist? No, he had infiltrated communist cells in, on the, I think, East Coast, we'll say New York and so on. And he was telling the information to the FBI. Lee saw that when he was in New York. His brother said he saw these episodes on TV when he was in Texas, but his brother says a lot of things that are wrong. Also says that Lee Oswald killed Kennedy, of which he knows nothing. But Lee actually saw these episodes when he was between, about 12 and a half and 13 and a half in New York. He saw the last episode. It could have been, the last episode he saw was like the 6th or 7th one. And then he returned with his mother to New Orleans. So we have a young man who in his early teens, he is just wants more than anything in the world to be a spy. He thinks of Herbert Philbrick as a father figure, someone to emulate. And so what does he do when he's 16? Well, first of all, when he's 15, he's joining the Civil Air Patrol. He's 15 and a half when you see a photograph of him with David W. Ferry. And I'll talk about David as quickly as I can, as soon as I can. But there's no doubt that David Ferry had connections with the CIA, and due to various circumstances that occurred, you can read about in the book Me and Lee, he recommended Lee to get a special training to see if he would qualify for work as a, CIA, or I should say, Office of Naval Intelligence operative. Lee told me that he was with the Office of Naval Intelligence, and he had been borrowed by the CIA. And I have found instances where that occurred in other cases. Because when I first said that, people were saying, what are you talking about? So I was diligent in finding other examples of that back there during the Cold War. Lee was not the first, nor the last. But Lee had a special circumstance when he was over there and had defected. First of all, remember, he wanted to join the Civil Air Patrol. He wanted to become a pilot originally. I think he had an idea, I will fly in something like what they had a few years later, the U-2. I'm going to be, I'm going to be a pilot, and maybe I'll, defect to the USSR and pretend that and bring all things with me. What we do know is that Lee Oswald did defect, and he did have information that was useful to pilots. He had a crypto clearance in Atsugi, Japan. He told me all about their underground chambers where he was drilled by the CIA. He was given special training on top of being trained by the Office of Naval Intelligence. He was learning Russian. Some of it he pretended to be learning on his own. As Jim Mars would tell you, Jim Mars, how many of you know who Jim Mars is? Okay, you know him personally. Jim Mars will tell you that back then anybody who was in the Marines, and by the way, Jesse Ventura, my friend, he will tell you the same thing. He was a Marine. He was a Navy SEAL. He was specialized. He'll tell you if anybody way back then, if they'd been on a ship and you hear somebody playing Russian music, and this is true, Lee Oswald's on this ship going over the Philippines, he's playing Russian music, he's practicing Russian, and when somebody called, he'd say something like, "You called, comrade?" Now, if you think somebody could get away with that and not get beat up, they knew something was going on. They knew that Lee Oswald was not going to be practicing Russian and doing this right in a ship filled with Navy patriots. These are Marines who want to kill communists with their bare hands. Don't you know, Lee Oswald would have been, he'd be pummeled to a pulp. There would be nothing left of him to send to the USSR. They knew something was up. They knew Lee is doing something. It's not, let's be quiet. We can see something's going on here. Lee with a sense of humor. "You called, comrade?" Think about it. So then we have, you see, Lee tried very hard to join the Marines when he was 16. He finally succeeded. A few days after his 17th birthday, he is a Marine. Now, he was the average height and weight and physiognomy of anybody at that time, average male, American male. To be a Marine, you have to be a bunch more. Anybody here has ever been a Marine? Okay, well, I wish I had a few in here because they're tough. almost said a dirty word. They're tough. And Lee had to do his best to, if it killed him, that man was going to pass boot camp. You understand, most of them were like a foot taller than he was and all muscly and everything like that. Lee kept up with him. He made it through boot camp. You'll find that there's a legend that after Oswald supposedly shot J.D. Tippit, this officer in Dallas, in Oak Cliff area, he's supposed to have walked away, say, poor dumb cop. Lee Oswald was raised, well, you know how we're raised here in the Middle West. I should say Chicago area, Indiana, Illinois. We're patriots. At least I was raised that way. I believed my government. I had faith in my government. I was someone who would salute the flag. You know, tears would come in my eyes when the parade went down the street and I saw the flag. I don't think that happens much anymore because so much has happened in our country. And it started when Kennedy was shot. That's where it began. Lee Oswald was the same way. In New Orleans, he was filled with pride. Both his brothers went into the armed services, and they say he joined as soon as he could. But imagine this young man so proud of his country, so proud that he could make a difference, wanting to become a spy with all his heart. He's going to be somebody like Herbert Philbrick. And they send him into the Soviet Union after a lot of training. Now, for anyone, I want to disabuse you right now, Lee Oswald was incapable of being brainwashed. At that time, after Korea, a lot of people had come back brainwashed, young men. They had been horribly abused. Lee went through training. He was one of those who could resist hypnosis. And you'll hear the officers are saying, the police officers saying that Lee said, I know what hard interrogation is like and soft interrogation. He knew all the interrogation methods. And as his lover, I can promise you, had no funny wires sticking out of his head or any of that stuff. Lee Oswald played chess, a great game of chess, I might add. He was studying Spanish. He'd been to many countries. He had a wife. He had 2 babies by the time of the assassination. In other words, he was a father. Even though he was planning to divorce his Soviet wife, he had to marry her so he wouldn't be deported when he was in the USSR. He liked her a lot, don't get me wrong, but it was not a marriage made in heaven. When I came to town, because I'd been offered this position, it was to work with Dr. Mary Sherman, a wonderful, famous cancer researcher. I wanted to cure cancer. My grandma had died of it. The reporters were following me around. I had given cancer to mice in only 7 days, lung cancer, faster than anyone had ever done in their fancy labs. And I did it in a lab under the high school stadium in Bradenton, Florida. And that impressed 2 Nobel Prize winners, 3 eminent doctors, and they gave me fast-track training. I learned how to handle the SV40 monkey virus. I learned how to handle cancers that would terrify you. I was assigned to make cancer more deadly. It's in the newspapers. I was told I was assigned this so that I would be able to, if we found out what made cancer more deadly, it would give us keys to conquering cancer. They lied to me. They were interested in creating biological weapons with cancer. And if you think after all they went through, including installing a linear particle accelerator to help design genetically new kinds of cancer, all right? If you think that they spent all that money and then just threw that away after this project, that was 50 years ago. Just think of what can be done today. Almost anybody can get cancer today, and you'll have to wonder where it came from. My friends, the fact that we haven't cured cancer tells you a great deal about the goals of our government.
Pretty fast.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. They're trying to say he had cancer for a long time in the hospital. We have Dr. Jolyon West, came down from Chicago. A lot of these people come from Chicago. Lee had a lot of contacts in Chicago, which maybe you didn't know, along with Dr. Mary Sherman. That, by the way, that's one of the reasons that Lee, I'll put it this way, the FBI called the Secret Service. We have Abraham Bolden. How many of you know who he is? Abraham Bolden. Well, you should. He lives in Chicago area, all right? And this is a wonderful, extraordinary man. He was selected by John F. Kennedy to be the first black Secret Service agent ever. He was on the Kennedy detail for a while, then he switched over back into Chicago. While in Chicago with his superior, FBI calls and says, stand down, you're not going to be protecting Kennedy because he's not coming. They stopped Kennedy just before he got on the plane. You can read about it in the wonderful book J.F.K. and the Unspeakable by James Douglas. They said, Kennedy, you can't go. The Secret Service tells Kennedy what to do. You can't go to Chicago. Kennedy doesn't go, but here's the FBI calling saying, look, Secret Service, you're going to stand down because we have arrested our men. And, oh, by the way, the name of the person who told us his name is Lee. Now, my Lee. And so probably 2 weeks, maybe a week. Anyway, about a week before the assassination when Lee called me, there were 3 last phone calls. The middle one didn't last very long, and we got disconnected. We had to go and I had to call him at the Texas School Book Depository. I'm the woman who said had no accent, who called the Texas School Book Depository and asked for Lee Oswald, the new janitor. But I always use the word janitor because my first 2 letters are J and Very. I was Judyth and Very. So that J.A. was for janitor. Of course, he wasn't a janitor, he was a clerk there. But Lee knew then it was me calling, and when I called, he knew when to call me back. So that's how that was arranged. And that call is on record. They say nobody knows who that was, it was me. And anyway, Lee calls me back, but the call that he made, not the Sunday before, which was the 17th, when he sent me the FBI, a telex. And we now know that the person who received that telex saved the original. He has brought it out. And sure enough, there's Lee's abominable spelling. Now, Lee was fantastic with his ear, could learn Russian fluently. He was intelligent, because he played a great game of chess. But don't ask him to spell anything decent, because it says assassination attempt, not assassination, assassination attempt is going to be, by this right-wing party. He just named somebody. He's not going to say it's the CIA or anything like that, or that's mafia. He's saying that because it doesn't matter who he's saying does it, just so he says the attempt is going to be made on Kennedy in Dallas. And that's what he put in. And he told me after that he was under tremendous suspicion. He didn't think he'd get out alive after that. And you know, the other thing he said, I believe I saved Kennedy's life. Anyway, earlier, a couple weeks earlier. We know that was 3 weeks before the assassination that a person named Lee advised Chicago FBI of a plot to kill Kennedy, and they caught him. And Kennedy's life was saved for 3 more weeks. And Lee is now under suspicion. They're going to get him. He knew they'd get him. Now, I was going to finish about Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby had seen the materials and the things we were doing. We explained to him, because he said to us, how are you going to kill Fidel Castro? Come on. I mean, true enough, we know now that a suit that was full of botulism, they were going to deliver that to Castro, but nobody wanted to deliver the suit, you understand? I mean, how are you going to get this done? We had very disaffected doctors surrounding Castro. Oh, they loved Castro, some of them did, but they were disaffected because, for example, Castro changed their salaries. I mean, they went on salary. They weren't making oodles and oodles of money anymore. None of them would be treating any rich movie stars that came down there for plastic surgery. I mean, they were losing, some of them probably lost $1 million, okay? And the kinds of special treatment that they used to give. By the way, I mean, Cuba had some great doctors, and Oxnard had trained many of them. And now Oxnard has these contacts down there. You take a little bottle and it says penicillin. You take a needle, you pull out what you think is penicillin, you inject it in the right place, and they think it's penicillin. You can give them cancer instead. That was the base of this whole thing. Castro smoked cigars as if they were going out of style. Every time you look at him, he has a cigar in his mouth, And for years, Oxner and Drs. Moore and Dr. Deal of the American Cancer Society, my three mentors, they were so interested in me because I gave these mice cancer in 7 days using cigarette products. That was the #1 reason that they were really interested in me. They'd been going around the country testifying at these trials where people had been dying of cancer from cigarette smoking. So they were very interested in me, and they were going to make sure that I had all this special training. And they sponsored that. That's where it started. That's not where it ended. Oxner, who had this terrible experience with his grandchildren, dreadful experience, realized that people trust their doctors. He had trusted the doctors that told him that cutter vaccine was safe as could be. When he injected them, think how he felt when the very next day California came out and said, look, we've got some people dying of it over here. Can we stop it? He missed by 1 day. If he'd only waited 1 more day, his grandchildren would not have died. His grandson would not have died. So he knows how much doctors are trusted. Here's Dr. Jolene West. He's with MK Ultra. That's mind control. MK, mind control ultra. This is how many Manchurian candidates were created. He comes down to the jail there. We have a special jailer. His name is Al Maddox. Al Maddox is with the police department. He is the #1 jailer for Jack Ruby. I not only visited him, I spent a couple of days with him all together. And he showed me Jack Ruby's glasses. The family sold his hat. Eventually had a stack of letters congratulating Jack Ruby for killing Lee Oswald. All kinds of personal little notes that Jack always sent, pressed into his hand. One of those notes said, they have injected me with cancer cells. They have injected me with cancer cells. He told his family, they have injected me with cancer. Did they believe him? No. But Al Maddox tended to believe him, and I'll tell you why. I said, well, Al, Jack Ruby did see our stuff. He came out over from Dallas, and he had been brought over by Carlos Marcello. He was a police fixer. Everybody knew him in Dallas, but there was some concern that Marcello had. He needed to know what was going on here. And the reason is Marcello wanted Castro dead too. We're talking about assessment. So what's your project about? And this is a secret that's not much of a secret when the mafia also gets hold of it. It showed Jack Ruby material and information because they were sponsoring it under the table. And of course, this is why Lee was involved. He did not want this to get in the wrong hands. Imagine cancer in the hands of the mafia. That wasn't going to happen. But we did have to say how this was going to work because we needed mafia people to set up certain things, like how do you get to Cuba? Who's going to take you there? Do you think the U.S. government is going to allow a plane to drop you off in Cuba? Well, we finally found some medical contacts that would be able to make it to Mexico City. And part of their ability to contact Lee Oswald, who would be sent there to hand over this material, was the fact that they had, shall we say, certain protections. The mafia wanted more than anything to get Cuba back so they could have their prostitution rings back, their drugs, and all that. So you have Johnny Roselli is working directly, as the CIA has told us, working directly with the CIA in representing the mafia. And on top of that, we have, and I think you really ought to know this, CIA and the mafia are so close to each other, working on this so close, sometimes you can tell one from another. I mean, if you CIA, it could also be mafia. Lee Oswald had been borrowed by the CIA. His mother had been dating the driver, okay? The driver, Carlos Marcello's own driver. His aunt, Lillian, was married to Deuce Moret, that's Charles Moret, who had been an enforcer for way back when Marcello was getting his act together in New Orleans. Deuce was beating up people.